Plenty to discuss on the Rugby Paper Podcast following round 3 of the Six Nations, but today's guest is very, very special. The end of last week also marked 1 year since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and joining us today from Kyiv is former Plymouth, Esher and Rotherham rugby player and the BBC News Ukraine correspondent James Waterhouse. Round 3 is done and dusted. As always, plenty to discuss. Brendan is here, Nick is here. No Chris Hewitt today to defend his shameful predictions. So we can chastise him at will. A very special guest, though. He played rugby for Rotherham, Esher and Plymouth, but now he's the BBC News Ukraine correspondent. We are, of course, just passing the anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And talking to us from out there, I'm guessing you're in Kyiv, James, is James Waterhouse.
Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, I join you from... I'm in and out of a hotel here, so I'm sat in my hotel room, which is increasingly feeling like a cell. So send help, but yeah.
Have you been in a hotel for the past year then?
In and out. So I've got a flat, but with the blackouts and, with the missile strikes, it's useful being near a shelter. Or otherwise I'm on the road. So it's pretty much just life out of a suitcase, which can be a bit brutal. But yeah, with the gear up to the anniversary, I've sort of been chained to Kyiv, which is no bad thing necessarily.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that anniversary then. Obviously, we'll get to the rugby, and people who watch rugby will have seen minute silences held to commemorate it. February 24th was the year mark. Just talk about the past weekend out there. Obviously, we commemorated it in the UK, but it's very different when you're there and then. So what's been going on to look back on it?
What I always go on are my Ukrainian colleagues, and I've got a producer called Anna Traunus who is born and raised in Kyiv, and I've kind of lived it through her in terms of the trauma of having her country invaded, being separated from family members, friends, falling out with Russian relatives, and she's found this week really difficult, and I think I've seen that kind of replicated elsewhere. But on Friday, it was clear that Ukraine wanted to mark this day, and I didn't know which way it would go. I think they've always tried to shine a light as much as possible on what the country is going through because it needs to lock down foreign support. It needs to sustain its war effort, and it was really poignant actually when you think about what the country went through this time a year ago, the shock, the trauma, and everything else, and here we are now at the back end, or sadly, a continuing chain of events from that one decision from Vladimir Putin. And I think it's going to be a very long time before we fully realise the full implications of what Russia's full-scale invasion has brought. But for me, President Zelensky called a 3-hour press conference in a hotel full of journalists, which shows the confidence he has. He's probably one of the most tightly protected guys on the planet. And he went to this hotel conference center. We all went through security, sat down, and he sat there for 3 hours and just took questions. And you could ask him anything. He was on good form. I just thought, yeah, this is a guy who embraces the risk of being a wartime leader. Because, if you're President Zelensky, you can't hang around somewhere for 15 minutes typically, because the Russians can locate you and you're at risk. But I just thought, what an extraordinary moment. He sort of sat there and took questions, and he wanted to kind of give the media something. And it was a strange, poignant day. Ukraine is still here, in a sense. It is still fighting for its survival, and its sense of identity has been strengthened after everything. So yeah, a poignant day, I'll be honest with you.
You mentioned that sort of sense of identity. Times of crisis often bring out that identity. Speak about how you have seen that in the sort of chronology of you being out there for the entire year.
Well, before the invasion, so I was here, I first rocked up 6 weeks before the invasion. And my job was sort of like the geopolitics of it all. So you would speak to people in the East, in Crimea, who were a lot more kind of Russian-leaning ideologically. But Russian-leaning doesn't necessarily mean being invaded and ruled by Russia. It can just mean wanting to have closer economic ties, for example, or identifying as Russian, certainly with older generations where there's a bit of kind of Soviet nostalgia. So he kind of explored that, and politically, just like Westminster, it's politicians try and take chunks out of each other. There are divisive issues and everything else. And President Zelensky was branded as a political lightweight. He's a comedian. He wasn't a great speaker before this war. And so it was kind of the throes of a typical European country, which, by the way, was already at war. We sort of easily forget, don't we? Separatist militants had been fighting in the east for 8 years when I arrived. Crimea had essentially been taken by Moscow without firing a shot. So what this war did, and also this was a country grappling with the Omicron variant of coronavirus. So there was kind of all the rules around masks and everything else. And it's amazing how the onset of this full-scale invasion just etch-a-sketched the whole thing, where there was, at the time, political unity. Coronavirus was put to one side, and on the whole, Ukrainians are kind of brought together with a common goal of survival. And time again, when Russia is aggressive, Ukraine tries to lean the other way, and it's happening this time just as it has in the past.
I'm right in saying you've not just been out since mid-Feb. It was start of January last year. Did you?
It was mid-Jan.
Mid-Jan. Okay, and that month build up, obviously Feb 24th. I think I've seen you talk about it in a sort of mini documentary about. Did you sleep through the first explosions?
Yes, I confess. Yeah.
Well,
I've got form here. I've got form here. There were these Iranian Shahed drones in the air last night, and the siren went off, and the tannoy went. I slept through that as well. I had to get woken up to go down to the shelter last night, so I've got form.
deep sleeper then.
Yeah, I could say overworked.
But what really interested, yeah, well, no kidding. But what really interested me about what you were talking about was you'd obviously been in the city for a month now, and Kyiv it's a young city, it's vibrant, it's got energy. And you woke up and these explosions had gone off, and the BBC have a balcony they record from, right? They have a vantage point from which you get quite a good view of the city. And, I know exactly what you're going to say, but a lot of people don't know. But speak about how you arrived onto the balcony, and you have to broadcast, because obviously journalism, the world waits for no one. You've got to report on this, and you saw a city that all of a sudden, over the course of one nap or sleep or whatever you were doing, has transformed.
Yeah, I know it will forever stay with me, really, where you have the politics, where we've been covering like this growing urgency and language from the West, who are saying it's gonna happen. The White House saying, look, we're not joking. And then you had Zelensky saying, don't panic, this is what Moscow does, we're not going to play into their hands. And so you had these kind of forces overhead, where you're in a city, and my job was, we were flat out covering this growing crisis. And we just treated it like any other story, but it was the biggest story I've ever dealt with at that time. And what happened at around 5 to 5 on that morning was the most sudden connection between the politics and then the military side. And all of a sudden, this gradual gathering of 150,000 troops with all that military hardware, suddenly it felt kinetic, where you'd had this kind of images of them doing exercises in Russia and Belarus. You had nuclear drills and everything else. All of a sudden, those images became real. And you had one of the biggest militaries in the world, moving in from 3 directions. And so that morning, the job became really, really simple, because it was a fast-moving, all-encompassing invasion, where we were with Ukrainians here who were realizing in real time what was happening to their hometowns, their relatives, people getting, they're having their homes destroyed. And there was shock and there was trauma. And so many Ukrainians would say, I can't believe he's actually done it. And for me, it's the speed. It was, in the blink of an eye, a city synonymous with nightlife, culture, fine dining, just went dark. And it became almost apocalyptic, where, I don't want to get too deep, but you could feel the fear. You could really feel the panic, where you're sort of walking down the road and people are angry, we tried to speak to people. They were so frightened. So, there was a queue outside a pharmacy that morning where people were desperately trying to get their medical prescriptions before they weren't able to. You had people, Zelensky tweeted, he said, anyone who wants an automatic rifle will get one. This is a Western leader. It was just an extraordinary morning. And then you had people running around with AK-47s on hastily assembled military checkpoints, pointing guns at people. It was just the speed of it. And, while there have been relative normalities restored in some areas, it's a state of war by definition is unlike anything else I've ever experienced.
James, can you
Sorry, go on, Brendan.
James, can you take us into your working week a little bit? And this might be the first occasion we touch on the rugby side, because we see you in front of the cameras, but of course it's a massive team effort. You've got drivers, translators, camera crew, editors on the ground. So we see your polished performance in front of the camera, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And there's a little bit of a parallel with rugby there, isn't that? In all the working parts have to work in unison to execute, to produce a performance.
I agree. It brings me great delight to bring a rugby analogy in this kind of answer, because, when you see Ollie Lawrence crossing over, we see that little clip against Wales and he touched the ball down on the fringe. There have been numerous phases to that point where everyone has kind of played their part. And, producers in a rugby sense are like buried under a pile of bodies, having hit numerous rucks to keep the ball going. You could go on, but it's before I open my mouth, there is so much that goes on, especially in a war of misinformation, just as much as anything else. We have analysts looking at foreign news reports, giving us reports, putting into context. I have a producer who's going through all the kind of sources and trying to work out what's going on, who is saying what. I have an editor making sure that we're, the logistics and making sure that we're on the right track. And none of it happens. The engineers operating a satellite dish on the roof, drivers, driving to some pretty hairy places at the drop of, at a second's notice sometimes. We have local producers who have the translation, who have, we're very blessed here to have such talented local journalists who the BBC employs on a freelance basis and kind of open doors for us and offer us really good insight. So yeah, it's just as much about the people you work with. I mean, I get the glory. I'm in a very, very, very privileged position in that, you get to kind of be the face of it or the voice of it or type some articles. But, I would be nowhere without, if I was to lose just one of my team, it would be a real struggle.
And to extend that rugby analogy a little bit, will you, if you get time, I suspect possibly you don't, will you take yourselves away and have a bit of a huddle, bit of a debrief? How can we do this better? Did we get that right? How can we sharpen this up? Where's the story going next? Where do we need to be? What's the next play, I suppose, is the rugby analogy.
Yeah, I guess what caught me out, Brendan, was, in a rugby sense, you have quite a linear kind of chain of command, don't you? You have your coach with captain, and then you have the kind of captain and maybe a couple of experienced players that will kind of spread that message, get a group focused and everything else. It's a bit more nuanced in news, where I would, of course, say, look, we need to be doing more of this or whatever else. But my producer, Anna, runs it, So the number of times she'll sort of say, okay, I hear you. Anyway, we need to, and then we'll just go ahead and say what,
She's the skipper.
And she's the skipper. And there's a separation between power and glory, where I get the glory as discussed, but it's the producers and the editors who do so much of the unsung stuff. But ultimately, I don't get indulged. I will get told in no uncertain terms, I need a script from you. This is all good and well, nice small talk, everything. I need a script from you, or we need to go here. Or, in the case of Anna, when I first arrived, I was just in sponge mode trying to absorb Ukrainian history and context and politics. And she would be straight. I'd come off air and she'd be like, we really need to talk about what you've just said. we'd be just working as we go, and you get like the snowball effect. So it really is a bit more nuanced. But my editor, Kate Peters, she's dedicated most of her working life to Russia, the region. She's a fluent speaker. Her knowledge is unparalleled, and she's a lot more subtle. She's been nothing but empowering. And early on, I was quite intimidated by her knowledge, but kind of blown away by how she didn't weaponize that, or she just kind of backed me. And I think I wasn't always blessed with that in rugby.
James, leadership's so important. You've touched on that. Just can you tell us a little bit more about Zelensky and how important he is as a figurehead in Ukraine? Because it just seems to me that his transformation as an individual has been extraordinary. And when you talk about cometh the hour, cometh the man, maybe small in stature, but he seems to have a hell of a heart.
Yeah, and I think what's unique, we talk about, his political unity, certainly at the start of the invasion. It's not just about a figurehead. People see Zelensky as a reflection of themselves, which is an unprecedented, for me, kind of political scenario, where the decision by him to stay, when by all intents and purposes, if you looked at all the analysis and all of the predictions, the Russians were going to come here and they were going to kill him. And he had the offer of a way out, and he turned it down. The US offered him a ticket. And I think there will be scrutiny down the line over his decisions early on in that invasion and before. Why didn't he act on Western warnings? Why didn't he better fortify the South when the Russians effectively just strolled in and occupied the territory they still do? But if we're talking in a kind of hot air balloon perspective moment, he stayed because he wanted to defend his country. And his wife came to him. He hasn't seen his parents since the outbreak of this war. He barely sees his kids. I think he's gone on to become the symbol, the reflection, the kind of manifestation of Ukraine's survival. And you can see the tolls on Friday when you look. We went through some archive of him throughout the year, and when he swapped the suit for the military fatigues, the toll this has visibly taken on him is plain to see. The weight that must be on his shoulders, the responsibility he feels. You saw the effect when he saw Bucha, where war crimes were committed when the Russians first retreated from Kyiv. He wears it. I've got to say, alongside this, we are talking about a very successful comedian, actor, producer. Strangely for administration, that takes care of itself. He can do the speeches. He can do the Q&A. When we were at that press conference, there was a camera on a jib. There was, two cameras either end. There was a professional photographer. The media just gets sent all this stuff. So the messaging weirdly takes care of itself. It's the kind of, you imagine it's probably the other decision making that he puts his focus on. So I think history will look on him favourably, because if he had left, then that would have left a vacuum. And when you're talking about the hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers that are dying every day, more on the Russian side, but if we're talking about people giving their lives, and if the leader had been absent, we might be talking under very different circumstances today.
How did you do it?
I'm still working that out, to be honest with you. Before Ukraine, I was a bit of a generalist, so I'd be quite at home doing. I did a few years in local TV. I could do sport. I remember doing one point doing a drag show evening for local TV, doing a live there and chatting to some of the acts, and I was quite at home doing it. It was fine, and whatever else. I had done some NATO exercises in the Arctic Circle when Russia started its campaign of aggression, and travelled a bit. Did anti-poaching operations in Malawi and everything else. So I knew I loved that kind of dicey environment side of things. I knew I liked being in the field and, being fairly independent. But I'm still processing the kind of learning curve I've been on, in the sense that you can prepare to a degree, but the amount you absorb once you arrive in a country and work with colleagues, make friends, interview politicians, get a feeling of attitude and culture and everything else. I mean, that alone is quite an extraordinary learning curve to go on. The outbreak of a war just accelerated that, really. So, I sort of live and breathe it. And I think as we talk now, I think I've more latterly appreciated the need to listen to myself, listen to my body when it's time for a rest. You don't want to leave yourself numb. Sometimes you need a bit of time and space to keep that kind of analytical view on things. But with Ukrainian colleagues, they feel a huge responsibility and guilt if they peel away. And me to a degree, but, I'm going to take a couple of weeks off next week, which I just, I know I need, and I'm going to completely switch off, So I don't know. The reason I've done it, let's bring it back, is the team I work with. I feel completely supported, listened to. People have been incredibly patient with me. And this is it would be like playing a match on your own. It just doesn't work. So I think that's how.
One of the big things we've noticed here, James, is despite the madness and the turmoil, and I suppose this is the same in many war zones, is the normality as well, how people just get on with their lives.
Yeah.
And I for my trouble, I follow the Ukrainian rugby feed on Twitter, and they've held all their winter training, their sevens competitions. They've got a European trophy match next week. I think, in fact, they're playing 2 matches, the national team. That's the 2nd division of the European Rugby League. So they just keep on buggering on, don't they? And that Amazing. Is very much a war thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, what embodied it for me was 5 days into the invasion, right? And we could hear automatic gunfire and shelling and all the rest of it when the Russians started to get held out about 30 kilometers away. And then I was doing a live report, and I could hear it, and there was, what's going on, James? What's going on behind you? And it was a pneumatic drill, because these sort of council workers had to resurface a road, and they were heading out and doing some tarmacking. And there were businesses here as well, like one of my favorite, some of my favorite lunch spots or coffee places. They were open, and people were visibly strained at the time, but they were like, well, of course we're going to open. Like, what else can we do? And then you were speaking to people who decided to stay. People left in their millions. Many stayed to either live out their lives or fight. And even if you go today, when you go to the east, for example, you go to somewhere like Kramatorsk, which comes under fairly regular shelling in bits. You can have people going to the market, going to the shop, queuing for petrol, chatting over a coffee. And then you sort of take a left off a main road and go 5 miles down the road to Bakhmut, and it's some of the most hostile environments you can ever report from. And that kind of sums it up. And this is a part of Ukraine that's seen 9 years of war and everything else. And it's just been a year full of contradictions in that sense. And even though it feels normal now where I am, you just need to speak to people, and they all know someone who's at the front. They know someone who's been killed. They have someone close to them who's fighting that they're worried about, or they're separated, or whatever else. So you don't have to scratch much to see just the constant, relentless effect this war has on people. And most people now are just shattered. They are exhausted by it.
On that note, one word that you've used on your Twitter quite a lot, actually, to look back on the past year, is hope. And I feel like hope can become sometimes a powerful symbol, but also it can be overused. Sometimes the term is used flippantly, and then it becomes devoid of meaning. Is there still meaning to the term hope in Kyiv as things stand? A year into this, obviously, Zelensky said he dreads to think if there's in 12 months that they're going to be in the same situation. Is there still that optimism? You mentioned the exhaustion. With exhaustion tends to come resignation as well.
Yeah, I think that question is what a lot of the audience are asking, which is, certainly like the BBC does all this kind of research around it, and people are rightfully asking, like, well, can they win? I've seen so much death and destruction. It's a human impulse, isn't it? Give me some hope, give me some light from the shadow. In terms of its meaning now, I mean, any Ukrainian would tell you, what else have I got? If I don't hope to prevail, then I may as well just roll over and let a Russian puppet regime take over this country, and all the lives that have been lost may well be for nothing. So hope will forever have meaning. I think our job as journalists, certainly when I asked Zelensky about it, is trying to separate that hope and belief from reality, and that's our job. It's not always a popular line of questioning. But you got to say, like, right, you're asking for support, you're confidently saying victory will come this year, but will it? Like what do you really need? And if it doesn't come, what are you going to blame? And the longer this kind of draws out, Ukraine knows that it's going to be pressure to enter peace negotiations. So you sense that it wants to desperately make some progress this year. But hope will forever have meaning, because what else have they got?
One other side of things is the side that the war is in the spotlight, and it's always, I actually study sociology of media at university at the moment, and we speak about media desensitization effect, and obviously, well, for those that don't know what that means, everyone's victim to it. The death, the devastation, the destruction you see in the news, you just become a little bit numb to it.
Yeah.
I know that you feel that it's a good thing that the war has been in the spotlight, but have you noticed a desensitization effect, both personally being out there, one, and also in terms of the reception of your work as well?
That's a good question. I think I don't want to sound crass, but there is a saturation point where how many piles of rubble can you see? How many burnt out buildings? How many firing howitzers can you see? There is a saturation point, no doubt. For me, I have to really work hard to separate myself. Like, I'm in it, obviously believe in the work we do. That's never going to change, but you do have to separate yourself. And I remember for the between February and about June, we covered everything. We tried to cover every aspect of this war: Russian advance here, alleged war crimes there, political scenarios here, everything else. And then eventually we sort of agreed that, look, we need to be more targeted with this. We are now hitting that point. There is audience fatigue. We've got the data which shows that without a kind of clear beginning, middle, and forecasted end, audience interest is waning, and people naturally want to know where that point of resolution is. And so what I try and do is play out scenarios with all the caveats, but we've got to try. I think the job to me is try and guide people down this path. That's not helped by the fact that this war could well last for years. Just look at what's happened before this point. But that to me is the job, and that's what actually now most of my effort goes into.
Is what? Sorry, can you clarify that latter bit that you said?
So I put most of my effort into trying to be as targeted and distinctive in storytelling as possible, rather than kind of doing a military weather forecast. Like, well, from the south, the Russians have made gains here and there, and they might be about to take Bakhmut. Meanwhile, Kherson was shelled again overnight, because you get all these reports all the time. It's about now sifting through and thinking, right, does this meet the threshold for telling a story today? And I think that's now the focus.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really interesting. And you said that you did notice, or have noticed, or may notice audience attention waning.
Interest waning.
Yeah, interest waning.
They do a lot of like sample studies, and they interview people from different backgrounds, and that's the kind of correlation at the moment. And
speak of the importance then of the war itself being in the spotlight. Obviously, in history, we've all studied, lots of wars in which there isn't this level of scrutiny, and someone like Zelensky wouldn't have become necessarily the world symbol that he's now become, for example. You think that's a good thing?
I think it's a good thing for Ukraine. I think what do you need out of a war? Well, you need a war leader. If you look at Winston Churchill, he suffered a very bad election defeat straight after the Second World War. But if we look at it now, looking back in history, he was clearly the figurehead that Britain needed at that moment in time. If you look at the parallels, look at Zelensky's visit to DC, and in his military overalls and addressing Congress. It's what I've learned. This was obviously my first war, but when you meet more experienced colleagues like Lee Doucette or Jeremy Bowen and Clive Myrie, and all the parallels they draw from wars gone by and the build-up, history sadly repeats itself. So, the importance of us telling the story of the first war in Europe since 1945 is an extension of those future history books, where hopefully, your kids will look at what we provided. They will shape writing in the future, and maybe those future decision makers might think twice before guiding us to a scenario like this again. I mean, it really is that kind of profound in my view.
On the subject of Jeremy Bowen, how did he take defeat on Saturday there?
He tactically took himself off to another pub. He turned down my invite of going to the bar here. So I took myself. I was in an English echo chamber with another colleague. He sort of took himself off, but he's sympathetic towards the players with all this kind of strike stuff. I'm just glad the game went ahead, but I was nervous of the Gallagher effect, I've got to say, because the Welsh, they would happily lose every game of the season as long as they beat us. So.
Yeah.
Well, three of the five of us predicted that they would. I think that is our window into the weekend of rugby. But yeah, James, it's remarkable what you're doing, and it's extraordinary to hear about it. And yeah, privilege to be able to ask you those sorts of questions. Yeah, there's no real way to transition into the rugby except to say, it's great that you got to watch. Did you watch all three games? Are you watching?
No. I saw the England game, and then I've just seen some other highlights. But I'm doing that thing where we lost to Scotland, so Scotland now need to win
it, which is obviously now less likely after the cracker of a game against France yesterday. We'll get to that in a second. Let's start with that England game then. Brendan, I'll come to you first. France-Scotland was fantastic. I think that made it even clearer that England wasn't the best of games you'll ever see, was it?
It was a bit stodgy. There was a lot on the line for both sides. The win was everything. My slight disappointment with England was that the first try was a cracker, and I thought that was going to be, the prototype for how they were going to approach the rest of the game. And in fact, the last try was extremely well taken, the one that James already mentioned by Ollie Lawrence. In between, it became a little bit Autumn Cup 2020, didn't it, with the box kicking? But I say the emphasis on winning was so big in this particular match that I suppose we can excuse that. I thought Wales were poor. I don't know quite what's happening. It's a very, very difficult week for them. I was expecting a bit more from Wales, if I'm honest. And now, they are fighting. Well, I think I did predict they would get the wooden spoon about 6 weeks ago. And then I'd sort of said that tongue in cheek, thinking I'll get some stick for this. But actually, they've got to beat, they have to beat Italy away now, which is not going to be easy. Otherwise, they will win the wooden spoon.
I think you did predict Italy would beat Wales. I predicted Wales would beat Italy, which I'm now feeling slightly remiss about. Nick, I'll come to you about the Owen Farrell conundrum, which I think was probably most highlighted in game 3 out of the championship. 44-ish% kick success rate. To me, he seems to play differently at 10 for England than he does for Saracens. At Saracens, you see he has an offloading game, he takes the ball to the line, good flat passes, clever tactical kicking. Him at 10 for England, he doesn't seem to really bring that same vigor.
I don't know. I mean, the goal kicking is a separate item. He's definitely got a case of the yips at the moment. It's just a question of how long he's persevered. That Borthwick perseveres with him as goal kicker, and you'd have to think possibly not that long, because the games against France and Ireland he's going to have to be on the money. Goal kicking wise, I thought that it's quite interesting what you've said about Farrell. in terms of his play in open field. I actually thought, I mean, he was involved in both of the tries, a very slick inside pass for Watson's try. So I'm not sure that I thought he was clunky in the first two games, and I thought he was less clunky on Saturday. But, you know, I mean, you compare him playing for Saracens, you know, I mean, he's been embedded in that Saracens team forever. So their patterns are absolutely embedded in his grey matter. So I think that he understands them very well, and he looks much more at ease. He's much more fluent at 10 for Saracens than he is with England. But it's early days for this England side. You know, I mean, it's not quite stutter steps. Actually, they do have more of a shape, more form. And the France game is every test is an acid test, and that's their next one. But I'm not sure that he looked. I sort of saw something of an advance about England as a whole, and I think he was a part of that.
Okay, that's interesting. It was the speed for me, and Wales didn't play with much pace, but I don't think England did either, not till Alex Mitchell came on. I thought he made actually a massive difference when he came on, and it's a shame Chris isn't here to inevitably sing his praises, because we know how much Chris loves Alex Mitchell. James, on the Owen Farrell conundrum, while Nick was talking, there was a lot of head shaking and then head nodding.
I'm so conflicted on a great England player, where I think now, given the improvements that Nick alluded to, have we reached the point of no return where it would be more disruptive to then bring in Marcus Smith? Do you now stick with what you've got? Given that, I think Ollie Lawrence is having a real box office spell. You look at the effect he's had at Bath, and he's in there and he's making things happen. And Farrell's always been a very, very kind of good, to me, a pivotal player where he distributes well, he defends well, and he's a solid kicker. So you can have the kind of electricity outside. That said, Marcus Smith is a whole different kind of entity. And it's if he comes in, I can see Ollie Lawrence still getting us over the gain line, and you could have him and Slade combining perfectly well. So, I'm glad I don't have to make these kind of selections, but I hold my hand up. Like any England fan, whenever we aren't playing well, my frustrations are targeted on a certain player. And it's been Farrell for the first couple of games. And it's not fair. I know he's the kind of fly half captain. Everything else leads from the front. So, when he purrs, you won't hear me complain. But I do worry about, the kind of lack of cohesion, where I do think our ball is slower. I think by the time it gets to 10 and goes out, it's a bit more telegraphed. And there are those moments as an England fan we think, it's like watching us in the old days where we were just, hopelessly uncompetitive. So I am conflicted, and I am relieved that it's not my call.
Brendan, who would you start at 10 for France?
Oh, I'm okay with Farrell starting, but I think if it's not working, you don't give Marcus Smith 25 seconds at the end.
Yeah, that was.
I think you bring him on 50 minutes, and you make, you've made the brave call to go with Owen Farrell ahead of Marcus Smith. You then have to make another brave call on 50, 55 minutes. Is it working? And actually, the call again is Farrell or Marcus Smith. I don't think you bring Smith on and move Owen Farrell to 12 and disrupt the 12-13 axis, which is beginning to look quite handy. So, I think I'd go with Owen for the France match, but just please give Marcus Smith some game time if it's warranted.
This is where I think Steve Borthwick has created a bit of an issue in making Farrell captain.
Yes,
because it means Farrell.
As Nick predicted about 3 weeks ago.
He did. And by that logic, Farrell has to play a full 80, or I don't think I've ever seen him be tactically taken off.
No,
with the game still in the balance, and it means that either you bring Smith on earlier and move Farrell to 12, which is not ideal, or what we saw on Saturday, Nick, which was the whole 15-second, 20-second get your cap nonsense with, I think it was three of them, wasn't it? It was Farrell, Arundel, and Walker.
Yeah.
Not Farrell, Smith, Arundel, and Walker.
Yeah. It's a nonsense, really. I don't understand that at all. I don't know whether it's something to do with player fees or whatever, but I do feel I've felt all the way along that Farrell shouldn't have been Borthwick's first captain. I think that he's got enough on his plate, being a goal kicker and being the ringmaster, and but it's a difficult change to make now in many ways. But it's I just feel that he is somebody who, just in terms of the way that he communicates, I don't think that the media aspect of things should be everything by any stretch of the imagination. It should be what you do on the pitch. But I think that when he falters a bit, as with his goal kicking and so on, it just calls into question the amount that he's got on his shoulders. And also, he's got good leaders in this team. Laws is back now. Laws' leadership has been pretty good, and you just feel that maybe it is a change that has to be made, even though it's a difficult one.
Realistically, do you think it's going to be made in the next 10 days or so?
No,
me neither.
I don't think there's a chance. I
No.
think that, he's Borthwick has set out his stall.
Yeah, I'd agree. Brendan, you mentioned that you were expecting a little bit more from Wales. James, I'll come to you about this actually. James, have you ever been to the Principality Stadium?
I have. It's a great day out, isn't it?
I've never actually been. It certainly looks like one, but something that I can't remember who was on commentary. It was Jiffy, who was actually on with us last week, and maybe it was Andrew Cotter, and they were commenting on the Principality Stadium being a little bit quiet. Like, not only Brendan, you said you were expecting more from the Welsh team. We spoke about hope. Is that then, James, you think emblematic of Welsh fans losing a little bit of hope?
I think so. I've got a lot of Welsh friends, and I think when you look at the Principality Stadium, when you look at the role of rugby in Wales and how the societal function it brings, right? This is a universal language. It is a vehicle for so many people to make friends and enjoy their weekends, and it is the glue that kind of brings everything together. And then you have, it's chaotic at the moment, where you have such inflated ticket pricing, in my view, which makes their beloved game inaccessible to so many. You have this chaotic central contracting going on, where players are de-incentivized to stay and play in Wales, and there is some talent coming through. I think there is a kind of broad fatigue descending on the sport at the moment, and I think a lot of Welsh fans, passionate as they are, may have already feared the worst going into that game, given just how poor they have been. And I'm completely sympathetic to the squad. It cannot be easy to play at that level, where we're talking about the finest of margins, and there is that political and personal chaos going on in the background. So yeah, I do think that probably distilled into the atmosphere there, and it's just sad to see in sport. I think it should be protected at all costs, and it's thankfully doesn't happen often. There's always room for reform. I don't think any rugby body out of any of the home nations is perfect, but it's sad to see it spill over, where you have players having to field questions that aren't about rugby.
I think the other factor on Saturday was that dampened the crowd was from the start. Wales's number one tactic seemed to be high balls to Freddie Stewart, the best catcher of high balls in world rugby, and they didn't stop for 80 minutes. I mean, other than the interception try by Rhys Zammit, that was about it in terms of tactics. So they didn't play a style that was going to ignite the crowd, and they needed to ignite the crowd on that day above all days.
Yeah,
they didn't give them any hook to hang their passion on at all.
No.
There was nothing there. And I mean, one of the things that I thought it showed was when you have a player like Stewart, that aerial ability is a super strength, because the aerial game is very, very important in the whole structure of it. It's almost like a sort of moving set piece in some ways. And if you have a player of that stature with that sort of timing and ability in the air, it, particularly if he's coming onto the ball and moving forward, you create a dynamic ruck off it or whatever. It's a huge advantage. Wales were outplayed they were also outplayed at the breakdown. England, one of the things that, I mean, we'll get to Scotland, but Scotland look to be a level of fitness above virtually any other team in the championship, perhaps with the exception of the Irish. And the pace of the game that they were playing at, I mean, the England-Wales game by comparison looked in slow motion compared to Scotland, France, Scotland, and compared to Italy, Ireland.
Mm.
Do you think buy-in becomes a little bit more difficult as well when obviously the fans will sympathise with their players, no doubt, but the Welsh Rugby Union is obviously the body that represents the Welsh Rugby team? And the comparison I made to someone the other day, and it is very different because Chelsea Football Club is not a nationality, so you're not necessarily tied to them in the same way. But I'm a Chelsea fan, and it is very difficult to, support a club with passion when you fundamentally disagree with the way that the powers that be at the top are acting. And Brendan, do you think that there's a case to be said there if Welsh fans aren't agreeing with the WRU and how they're behaving?
Well, I mean, there is a world weariness about Welsh fans and WRU, but let me tell you, as somebody who worked down there for 4 years, no Welsh rugby fan is ever happy about anything, really. I mean, there is always a bit of a whinge going on. And I've got to tell you, some of their greatest Six Nations Grand Slams and Championships have come off, you listen to them in January and the world's about to end. So, doom and gloom is part of the Welsh scene, but there is a disaffection with the WRU at the moment. And I think perhaps the misogyny and the sexism cases of sort of that were revealed about 6 weeks ago, that might have tipped it over to a more serious opposition against them. But they're in a bit of a hole, Wales, at the moment. Be interesting to see how they come out of it.
Yeah. It will. Massive test in Rome for them. And I think, for the first time in a long time, they're going in as out-and-out second favourites. Feel free to disagree with me saying that, by the way, anyone. But let's look at Scotland versus France. And one name comes to mind, and he wasn't on the winning side yesterday, Nick, but Hugh Jones. He's a hell of a player at the top of his game, and he certainly is that at the moment.
Well, he is. He's exceptional. He's got he's the whole package, really. He's got pace. He's powerful too. I mean, Dupont was hanging on to him for one of his tries, and we know how that he's a pocket battleship when it comes to physical power, and he shrugged him off to dot the ball down. His timing, the late timing of his runs seems to mesh perfectly with Finn Russell's passing game, and he's very, very good, and one of the players of the tournament so far. And he was, he obviously I think he picked up injuries because he was instrumental in Scotland's win over England back in the Eddie Jones era in 2018. Then he seemed to disappear for a while, and he reinvented himself at Harlequins, I think, a season ago, probably after injury troubles. And he's back to his best now. And he's if there was a Lions team being picked, he'd be in it.
I think if I remember rightly, it was, and maybe Brendan or James, you could comment on this, it was defensive problems, wasn't it? And he just sort of lost all confidence, and it was a sort of general case of the.
I think there was some injury problems there, but
and a few injuries.
Scotland also have a lot of centres to pick, and I can remember talking to Gregor about this. He had about 4 combinations, and he just didn't go with the one that has now emerged as the top combination. I mean, Hugh Jones is an interesting bloke. I watched him at the Rotherham Park Sevens 10 years ago. Look a world beater then. Looked a complete world beater. But then, the path that he went down to South Africa, didn't he? And sort of disappeared off the scene a bit. He was a Millfield lad, went down to South Africa. Then he comes back. Then he's Scotland qualified, breaks into the Scotland team. Then he disappears again. And now he's like the best centre in Europe, or one of the best centres in Europe. So I don't know what the lesson is there, other than, you can take the scenic route sometimes, and it doesn't do you any harm.
I love those
he's great
journeys.
to watch.
I'd rather it pan out that
We must talk about your journey soon, James, because you took a pretty scenic journey, I think.
way. Not scenic enough.
James, what do you make of Scotland at the moment? I mean, I speak all the time, every time I speak about them, about their World Cup group from hell. But is this a Scotland that is actually going to a World Cup as a world beater for once?
If we're going to define world beater as a team capable of winning the World Cup, I will say no. But I will say this is the best Scotland team I have seen in my lifetime. I remember it was 99, wasn't it, when they won the Five Nations? We're seeing a team almost like the Eddie Jones Japan side, where they are playing such a quick front foot style of play. I think it's strangely worked out okay for Townsend, in the sense that he's shown he's willing to kind of drop Finn Russell in the past. That's well documented. And yet he's now sort of harnessing his brilliance on the international stage, where I just love watching Finn Russell. He's standing flat. He's got the talent outside of him, as discussed. And they are great fun to watch, and they do look fitter. I do agree with that. We've got forwards with an amazing work rate. We've got is it Van der Merwe?
Yeah, the winger,
who's just superhuman at the moment, and they just all seem to be complementing each other so well. And you wonder what could have been different if it wasn't for the red card over the weekend. So I do think we are looking at the best Scotland side we have seen for some time. I think they are going to nevertheless have to seriously punch above their weight to leave us talking about them after the World Cup. But I would be delighted to be proved wrong. Yeah. Not too delighted though. I'd obviously like us to win it.
I think, well, they've obviously got to get out of that World Cup group first with Ireland and South Africa, which will be interesting. Let's talk about France very briefly. And again, there's one player that comes to mind in terms of quashing a couple of doubts. Nick, you've spoken about the pressure on Ntamack. Do you think he responded somewhat?
No, I don't. I think that if you compare his influence with Russell's, particularly in the last, sort of almost the last hour of the game, there was, one fly half was head and shoulders above the other. Now Russell's a rare bird, but Ntamack had some of that sort of kudos himself when he first came into the side, and I noticed his leg was very heavily strapped, and he almost, apart from he got over for a good try, but or rounded off a good try, but he's not playing at the top of his game at all. And I like Jalibert. If Jalibert is the French equivalent of Russell to a degree, and having those two on the field against each other would have been an interesting thing. And Jalibert brought something to France when he came on late again. It was his decision, I'm pretty sure, to switch the ball, which ended in Ficou's try at the end. So no, I'm not convinced by Ntamack at the moment at all.
There's a sort of worry now for France as well at tight head. Obviously, no Antonio for being red carded last week. This week, who I don't actually know how to say his name. Hua.
Yep.
He got red carded. The first player to ever be red carded twice in the Six Nations, if I'm not wrong about that. But Nick, obviously you're the scrum expert. Falatia, I thought, actually played very well when he came on. But is that somewhere an England scrum that is improving, is looking to exploit?
I don't. It's a good question. I mean, the England scrum was better. I don't think that the Wales scrum was a scrum that really tested it at all, and they're going to be tested. Antonio is a big miss for the French. Howes is pretty solid when he can stay on the field. And the guy Falatea who came on, so he's their third string tight head. He started pretty well, but he actually faded a bit. And I wonder just how many of these props are really used to, right at the top end of the game, are really used to putting in 80-minute shifts. And it's a very, very important, I think that it's a very important element for you to have in a team. They're too used to sort of 50-minute shifts, and you see guys falling off quite a lot. And I thought Falatea looked very weary by the end of the game.
Yeah,
but if there's one country that has got depth at prop, I would say it's France. So they'll probably wheel somebody out.
We've never heard of.
Very formidable.
Be a rock star.
Yeah, 140 kilo monster probably as well, knowing them.
Ollie, just one more thing on that match, and I've never really noticed it before. We had the 2 red cards, and how really badly it affected them. In that, not only did you lose the player who was sent off, but Scotland, and it was their decision, but they decided to take Hamish Watson off so that they could have a second row come on, and that really affected their back row. He was picked with a very specific job in mind against France. He was picked over Luke Crosby, who had 2 pretty decent matches in the first 2 matches. And then you got the French, to fulfill their front row, they had to take a player off, and they took off Aldrich, who is, I think we agree, he hasn't been quite on last season's form, but I thought he'd started pretty well and was looking for a big match, and they suddenly lose Aldrich. So he got 2 changes on both sides, not just one. And for some reason, I'd never really clocked how sort of impactful sometimes these sending offs are. But yeah, a lot of reorganisation to do from both sides there.
Aldrich was in my Six Nations fantasy team as well, so I was really unhappy about that because what he got, he got hooked very early. Sorry, Nick, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, yeah, it did have a big impact, but it was still a really cracking game.
Oh, absolutely. But it probably changed the way both sides played a little bit, I think.
For sure. But those 2 back row forwards, I mean, Watson coming back after a fairly lengthy injury, Aldrich not right at the top of his form, as you say, although they both looked as if they'd settled into the game quite well. So they might have sort of cancelled each other out one way or another.
Yeah, and but Hamish Watson probably could have used the minutes with Ireland to come in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah.
So well, England obviously play France at Twickenham in a couple of weeks' time. Join us next week. We'll be previewing that and all the other 2 fixtures as well with Will Greenwood. I'm conscious of time. James, do you need to get going?
What time is it now? I could do another 10 if you need me.
How about Rugby 15 from James? I think you'd have a good one.
Yeah? Should we do the random Rugby 15?
I think you'd have a good one.
Okay, let's do a random Rugby 15. Not in the middle of the episode as we usually do, but discussion was a bit too pressing. A little finale then for the episode. James, I did send you the questions in advance, I think. There aren't too many shocks and surprises. But yeah, let's get going. Nickname.
Moose, given to me at 18, apparently because of the way I ran, a real sort of clumsy high leg lift. I'm told it's affectionate, and I believe it. So,
was that on the pitch nickname or off the pitch?
We now have 2 mooses on this podcast.
Yeah, have we? Who was the first?
Yeah, Nick Cain, the moose, meet James Waterhouse, the moose.
have you got the antlers somewhere, James?
Yeah. Tucked away. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to tackle a moose, to be fair. They're bloody enormous, those things. Best rugby memory.
It was a draw. As an Esher side fighting for our survival, we went to play Exeter at their shiny new Sandy Park Stadium. They were battling it out with Bristol to get promoted, and we scuppered them with a 12-all draw. And as a team, we made more than 140 tackles. Was it one for the archive? Probably not, but it was a great bus trip home.
It was a winning draw then.
Yeah.
Most embarrassing rugby memory.
As a excitable 12-year-old desperate to play for the Aylesbury A team, I was playing for the B team and I got given the ball and I ran the wrong way. And I scored it over the wrong touchline and try line.
Good. An own try.
Yeah.
Pre-game tune.
Oh, I would go. What would I play? I'd like to do like a bit of Green Day. I was never like a head banging kind of, let's get completely over aroused kind of guy, get the smelling salts. I would just play a bit of Green Day. I'd enjoy the social side of it, I go and say hello to people. But yeah, Green Day, Dookie, that album, just kind of got me in a bit of a happy place.
Nice. I would say Green Day slightly headbanging, or can be. American Idiot, Holiday.
Yeah, kind of. It's more of a kind of side to side.
It's more up, but yeah, I get
a kind of full bow. Yeah,
I get what you mean. Post game meal.
Oh, I love the lasagna. If a clubhouse put on a lasagna, I was pretty happy with some token sort of salad at the side. But yeah, good lasagna and garlic bread, of course.
Of course. Best player you've played against?
Played against was Tom Varndale. He was in my age group, so he played for Chinner growing up. I played for Aylesbury, and then I remember doing a horrendous England schoolboy trial match at under 16, where I was playing against a backline of Ryan Lamb, Varndale on the wing, Ollie Morgan at fullback, and it was just a miserable afternoon. Needless to say, I was not progressed. He could just go ghost past people. He was effortless.
Best player you've played with?
George Lowe, the Harlequin centre. He came on loan to Esher, and it was as simple as just give him the ball. He tore up in the old National One.
Favorite player right now?
Finn Russell. I just think he's got the kind of complexity about him that I just love. I watched him at Racing on holiday last year, and just love him. Effortless.
Rugby idol?
Probably Richard Hill growing up. I remember my dad watching me take me to Saracens, and just all the sheer amount of work he got through, and I just kind of tried to model myself on him. Never happened in the end, but.
Favorite stadium?
This is going to really pain me, but the Principality is just, it's such a rarity to have a ground in the middle of a city.
What about favorite stadium you've played at? Assuming you haven't played at the Principality.
Confirming I have not played at the Principality. Where was good to play? The Memorial Ground, we went to play. Bristol was good fun, just in terms of playing surface and location and everything else. I enjoyed that one.
Favorite gym exercise?
God, my response is telling you loads, isn't it?
Well, the look of disgust on your face is.
Yeah, well. I know. I was more of more anchored in the amateur era. I think anything, a rower. That's the only thing I was remotely decent at. Long levers.
Occupation if rugby didn't exist. I think that's easy.
Yeah.
Superstitions?
None.
Nice.
Don't buy into it.
Rugby law you would change?
I'd get rid of competing for the ball on the ground. I just let it play, just speed it up.
No, no jackling.
No jackling.
Go back to rucking.
Just speed it up a bit.
Yeah.
But,
Jiffy said that last week as well. He did. Best thing about working in rugby?
Just the amount of time you spend with your mates, and then having that shared weekly experience. So that's two things. But which you don't replicate.
Awesome. Cool. Well, that's the first time we've ever done that to wrap up the episode, but I'm glad we did.
End on the low.
Or the high of you running the wrong way and scoring an own try. Thank you for doing that, James. I'll just run down the predictions league very quickly. James, you're kind of like a mascot for the special guests team. I know, what we do is we do a score prediction leading up to the game. So no games for you to predict this week, but you're on a team with Jiffy, Jerry Guscott and Scott Hastings. And you're doing okay so far. Nick has, actually Chris Hewitt got a perfect score for France, although he got Wales-England wrong. He's propelled up the leaderboard to draw level with Nick Cain in the wooden spoon position. How do you feel about that, Nick?
Yeah, gutted. An unwelcome company is what I would say as well.
Yeah, well, like we say, unfortunately, he's not here to rub salt in the wound this week. I'm sure he'll have something to say next week. Brendan and I were the only two to get 3 correct results, actually, because we predicted an England win, unlike the other 3 donuts. Brendan, I've just gone ahead of you. So the 23-year-old has taken the lead. I got 22 points and Brendan got 21. But yeah, it's close. It's close. I'm on 51. Brendan's on 50. Special guest on 47. Nick and Chris.
Okay.
Some way, but
enough of the gloating.
You're some way behind on. I think you
also
we
should point out that league tables can be a bit dodgy, as James will tell you. I think his Esher side once got relegated in a season when he got 61 points and was it 11 wins, and somehow for the restructuring that went on that year, that saw Esher go down, which was absolutely fucking bonkers.
I still can't talk about it. We were like 20 odd points above Sedgley Park, went down with them.
How
rubbish.
That was the season you drew 12 all with Exeter.
We had a huge, when they changed the old National One into the Championship, so they culled 5 teams and let the promoted side from the now National One come up, and it was brutal, but it was the best season I had, in terms of what we went through and the upsets we brought. But I don't think I will ever be over it.
61 points and relegated. I mean, that's just not fair, is it?
I like that that, Brendan. That means a lot.
I'm a complete nerd with stuff like that.
and you said finishing on a low. Well, I guess Brendan's ensured that now. James, it's been phenomenal having you on. A fascinating and really unique first half of the Rugby Paper. And thank you for speaking out about all of it. And I mean, I can't really say anything except good luck with.
Keep up the good work.
And enjoy the 2 weeks
guys,
off.
Appreciate it.
Enjoy the 2 weeks off.
It's a real privilege to be on, and it's great to kind of, rugby is still a massive source of pleasure for me. So it's great to meet you all.
Yeah. Go on, Maestro. Stay safe.
Likewise. Yeah, stay safe. Thank you, James.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks for listening to this week's edition of the Rugby Paper Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe on whichever podcast platform you use and recommend the show to your friends. The Rugby Paper is available to buy every Sunday, and to make sure you don't miss it, subscribe through our print, digital and online options at therugbypaper.co.uk/subscriptions. That's therugbypaper.co.uk/subscriptions to get all our content for as little as 14p per day.